Continuing with the theme of, is this the current geopolitical reality or an unhinged creative writing prompt? Let's imagine for a second that NATO effectively becomes worthless for the remainder of Trump's presidency. What then? Well, I suspect that most have a good sense that this would be very bad for Europe, because it will be very bad for Europe. Russia will take advantage and make some kind of inroads along the eastern flank. But Europe's fate might actually be worse. We are talking about war. And I am not saying this in the vague sense of Russia detects weakness and therefore attacks for reasons. I mean that there is a very specific bargaining problem that could arise out of the situation. And, ironically, what triggers the war is not Trump pulling out of NATO. It is what happens after Trump leaves office that creates the bargaining friction. Thinking about this now is important, of course, because the extent of the problem informs how much effort political actors in the present would want to work to stop it. And you better believe that I brought the lines on maps to prove these assertions. To get us into the game, we are going to jump in and assume that the US side of Article 5 is de facto broken. Now, how it is broken is not particularly relevant for our purposes today. But everything else that we will cover in this video is conditional on that having happened. Note that the betting markets for a Greenland invasion are at roughly 10%, and the odds of a US withdrawal from NATO this year are roughly at 14%. Please do not add those together because they are correlated, as an invasion might precede the official withdrawal. Also worth noting is that the NATO withdrawal possibility is made complicated by how Congress legally controls that decision. But legality is not what is important here. It is the collective expectation in practice that matters. Welcome to the world where laws are not enforceable. In any case, the immediate effect of Europe losing the US security guarantee is ambiguous, and depends on what you think is happening in Russia. To be clear, it is bad news for Europe in either case. This is not just a question of losing the metal and manpower that the United States brings to the table. It is also that the United States coordinates European security, in a supremely and commanding way. The United States leaving that role then creates a vacuum that Europe cannot instantly fill. But the extent of that bad news and the time period in which it matters will vary depending on Russian politics. The easier perspective is to look at what is happening in Ukraine. Note that the Kremlin is wasting away its resources on the front lines, and so Russia's power losses offset whatever negative things are happening with Europe. Thus, the line stays still. What happens between them in the very long term would then depend on how effectively Russia can reconstitute its forces, and what happens with European rearmament in the meantime. It is not reassuring that Russia has all sorts of combat experience now, and is way ahead of the West when it comes to drone production, a problem that we have discussed before, and that I suppose, have negatively contributed to. But there is a medium-term problem that will take precedence over all of that, so I will not speak further about the distant future in this video. The more nuanced take, and one that we have explored before on this channel, is that the Russian military is only politically limited in Ukraine. If the Kremlin could mobilize greater public support for the war, then it would have sufficient manpower to move the line and move faster than a snail, which through 4 years the invaders are still somehow slower than. Instead, the Kremlin has to recruit relatively small numbers of soldiers each month via competitive contracts, and has to scale back its aspirations accordingly. Extending this logic a step, imagine that the Kremlin can convince Russians that there is a collective threat from, or opportunity to exploit, the now neutered NATO. Then suddenly those estimates of Russia needing 5 years to reconstitute its army go out the window. Note that I am not suggesting that the Kremlin convince the Russian public of plans to re-establish the Warsaw Pact here. Even just some support to seize the Baltics would suffice. Then, lo and behold, the absence of the United States causes the line to shift. But note for the standard reasons that we should not expect a war out of this situation. Fighting is still inefficient. People will die. Rubles will turn into rubble. and thus the parties would learn to live with a new normal commensurate with the new balance of power. Now, that does not necessarily mean that the official lines on maps will change, but it does allow Russia to exert influence over Western governments in a manner that the Allies would be forced to put up with, given that they cannot rely on US defenses. To be clear, NATO by its nature is a defensive alliance, but that does not mean that NATO is only interested in deterring a war. It also cares about having the coordinated military strength to stand up against extractive and manipulative foreign governments. The loss of a US security guarantee handicaps that ability, and thus the news here is bad for Europe, even if we are not predicting that a war will transpire. It is also why you may have noticed criticism of Donald Trump over the Greenland gaslighting become increasingly muted as you move further east, as those countries expect to internalize greater problems without the United States involved in NATO. This subcase, where the Kremlin could mobilize domestic support, is the interesting one to consider when thinking about the medium-term implications. So let's roll with it for the rest of the video. That is, we are assuming that 1. Trump breaks NATO, and 2. The Kremlin can generate popular support for a war with Europe in a manner that is not possible with Ukraine. Well, the bargaining issue arises when we think about what happens after Trump leaves office in 2029, and specifically who follows him. This could go in one of two ways. Possibility 1 is that Trump passes the torch to J.D. Vance. The betting odds of that are 26.5% right now. In that case, the line for Europe stays steady, and if everyone knew that this would be the case, then there is no bargaining issue to speak of. Possibility 2 is that the new president seeks to reestablish the US commitment to NATO, which really would not be that hard to do. It is just a pledge to be committed to the defense of Europe, and the world believing it because of the disposition of the new leader. The more straightforward way for this to happen is that a Democrat wins the presidency. The betting odds of that? 54.8%. The less straightforward way for that to happen is that a Republican successfully makes a hard pivot away from Trumpian foreign policy and manages to win the presidency with a coalition not seen since 2004. Marco Rubio, of course, would be the clearest such candidate. Current betting odds? 8.6%, a relatively low number because he would first have to beat Vance in a primary. Actually, I have a much longer comment about how a world where Rubio tries to make this play would make 2027 and 2028 an absolute nightmare for Democrats, but I will save that thought for the midterm elections. Anyway, this new president would improve European security. Of course, it will not quite look as good as it once did. Europe would be hesitant to trust the United States with long-term arms investments, disrupting how NATO has exploited comparative advantages for 3/4 of a century. So you get the thrust of the intervention force, but a lower overall quality and quantity of armaments. It will still be better for Europe than the Trump pullout years, just not at its theoretical maximum. The problem here is that if Russia knew that this is what will happen in the future, then it would run into the standard Preventive War Incentive. Assuming that the costs of war are sufficiently small, what Russia could take without the US backstop is more than what Russia could expect to extract from Europe in the long term, once the United States was helping again. This is the same preventive war mechanism that drove the United States to bomb Iran's nuclear program last year. It is also the same as one of the arguments for why Russia may have invaded Ukraine in 2022, with the reminder that even defensive alliances can be threatening to an aggressor, in the same way that the installation of a security system frustrates a would-be thief. Basically, the door for military action is closing, and the attacking party wants to strike when it is easier, rather than wait to use the same threats when the action is harder. And it is also part of what drove Europe to pledge to increase core defense spending to 3.5% of GDP back at the Hague Summit. Suppose that the United States were distracted by a war in the Taiwan Strait. Then Europe would need sufficient military capabilities to limit what sort of short-term power spike Moscow could enjoy by coordinating with Beijing on, say, the invasion of the Baltics. Circling back to the current NATO problem, this war mechanism is absolutely perverse for Europe. The expectation that the United States may be helpful once again causes Russia to fight a war. Of course, in practice, Russia does not know which type of candidate will win the presidency. The Kremlin could have a reasonable expectation by the spring of 2028, assuming that Rubio has beaten Vance in the primaries. If so, then the United States returns to Europe regardless of who wins the general election. But if Vance is the Republican nominee, then no one will really know which way things will go until November. If the Kremlin puts a high enough weight on the Democrat, then we will be left with that type of preventive war. One critical thing that I need to add here is that all of our conversation today has been predicated on a world in which the United States abandons its NATO commitment. This is relevant because NATO is popular in the United States. Democratic support for the organization consistently reaches 90%. Republicans are a bit more mixed, but often show majority support too. It just might not feel that way because of who currently resides in the White House. The point is that if Trump withdrew, those voters would activate, and the conditional probability that a candidate like Vance wins the presidency goes down. The upshot for Europe is that war is not inevitable here. Hidden in what forms an expected outcome is how long the war goes. If, for example, Russia would take years to lock in any benefits from fighting, then the whole enterprise is shot. By the time that Russia would hope to succeed, a Democrat may be in office and start the intervention. Or maybe it's Rubio. I say that because, it is not like another country has experience forcing Russia to fight for every square kilometer of land and making sure that the pace of war is glacial. And hey, all the more reason for the Baltics to continue working on those defensive fortifications. If the intricacies of NATO policies are your jam, then good news. I have an entire playlist on that subject. But for now, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.